Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of The Suspense is Killing Me. Chris Panatier is here. What's
Hey
going on,
man.
dude?
Well, it's a couple days past my book release, and so I'm actually relieved, to be honest. Like, book releases are stressful, and you and I talked about this a little bit before, but they're a little stressful. From the outside looking in, I think all my friends are like, "Oh my God, this is so great," and all I'm thinking is, I need another deal. I need another book deal. But since then, so nice to see everybody shouting about it and helping boost the book and everything, and people who have reviewed it going on, and kind of, even mentioning things I didn't necessarily realize about the book or things that weren't necessarily at the forefront that kind of made me think about it a little bit more. So it's been really cool. I'm doing pretty good, and I'm revising the next thing to send to my agent that we can hopefully sub real soon.
Oh, look at you. Got the got the pile on
Hopefully,
the head. I love it. Foot on the gas pedal, man. You got to do it.
always, man.
And you're talking about the redemption of Morgan Bright, which just came out this week, like 2 days ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh my God! Congratulations, happy birthday, man. It's such a
Thank you.
surreal thing to experience.
Yeah,
And you've had quite the launch, which is awesome.
yeah. I mean, the horror community like really seemed to get behind this one and lift it up because I'm this is my first full throated horror novel. My first novel, The Phlebotomist, is horror. It's a little lighter. Redemption of Morgan Bright is like all the way in, foot to the pedal. I set out to write the most horror I could horror with the Redemption of Morgan Bright. So it's been really nice to see how people have embraced it and how they have mostly enjoyed it.
I mean, it's a big deal to do that, to put your foot all the way in the gas pedal on horror like that. I didn't, I didn't do quite so much of that in my earlier stuff, but I think like progressively it's gotten more and more like that. And I didn't plan it that way. It's just like I almost needed to be like convinced that it was okay for me to step into like full on horror, to make that work. And you've written quite a bit of short story content way before the redemption was even dreamt up. So do you feel like there was like a ramp up period for you there?
That's a great question, and actually a very good observation, because I've been asked, like, why did you pivot to horror? And in my novels, I certainly did. This is my third novel. The first two were science fiction. Like I said, The Phlebotomist. If any listeners read The Phlebotomist, like you're gonna read it and go, well, this is horror, and it kind of is. But I didn't. When I wrote that book, it is a near future sci-fi dystopian, the Phlebotomist.
Oh,
I pushed back against people saying it was horror. I don't know why. And then my second book is called Stringers, and that one is a humorous space opera about two stoners who get abducted. Okay, and but it also explores the nature of the universe and consciousness itself. It's doing a lot, but
right.
to your question, you're right. Like, all my short stories that I was writing, whether it's flash fiction or a short story or whatever, that I was writing starting around 2018, 2019, like 90% of them, or 95% of them are straight up horror. They're like all horror. And so, whether I knew it or not, it seems like that was always my trajectory. But I wasn't labeling myself as a horror writer, not because of some aversion to labels in that respect, because I like being thought of as a horror writer. Like, if people think of me that way, that's fantastic. I love that. But I think honestly, it was because I didn't think of myself as a horror writer then, because I wasn't reading a lot of horror then, and I wasn't watching a lot of horror. And the reason is because I'm a scaredy cat. And so so I could write it.
Wait, what?
Yeah. No, I'll tell you, but like, full confession, I'll tell you. But I could write it, and I think the reason I could write it is, of course, to me, I have a very keen sense of the dark side of humanity. Okay, and I
Right.
think a lot of horror writers really do. Okay, um, but for me, I could write it no problem because you're the architect. Like you're
Mm.
constructing it, and it's frankly it's just not scary to create it, but to consume it, it can be very scary. And I mean, it's funny. I guess my trajectory for my whole life was aimed here because I can remember in the 80s as a kid being in the grocery store when my mom would go grocery shopping and tagging along. And I would just sit in the magazine aisle and I'd be down at the
Yes.
bottom where they hide all the gross horror magazines, like Fangoria, of
Yeah.
course. And
Yeah.
I would have my face buried in those magazines, freaking myself out, utterly freaking myself out, letting my imagination go wild. And with friends trying to watch horror movies whenever I could because my parents wouldn't let me do it, and scaring myself a lot, really scaring myself a lot. And then as I got older and moved into adulthood, I held on to that frame of mind that this
Mm.
stuff was too scary. You're talking to someone who's still afraid of the dark, okay? Like I go to bed, truly, I go to bed, my mind starts going. I
As soon as you flip the switch.
as soon as I flip the switch, but it's almost indulgent. It's almost an indulgent um,
Yeah.
fear of the dark that's not a real fear of the dark. Although I do sometimes scare myself as I'm falling asleep and weird shit happens. But like I have tweeted about Laurel Hightower's new book called The Day of the Door, and there's some
Right.
really scary, terrifying shadow imagery. And man, between that and watching the movie Talk to Me, I will sit in my bed and like look into this corner of the room that is really dark, and I'm just waiting for the thing to come out of it, right? And like I say, it's indulgent. I know it's not going to happen, but what if I could will it into happening? Um, I don't
Be
actually
careful with
believe.
that. I've read.
I know, right? Like my experience is that I don't believe it will happen, but I'm agnostic on most things, right? I don't
Mm.
believe something until there's evidence of it. But if there's evidence of it, man, fine, fine, it happened. And I'm kind of like that with horror stuff. And so what happened to me was for all the way well into my adulthood, man, I didn't watch a lot of horror movies. I didn't read any horror because in my mind it was all too scary. Only did I start to really explore it with the short stories. And then as I became a writer and started to go, horror is where you really get these intimate examinations of
Yep.
the human spirit. And I kind of got there and sort of camped out, and I realized I really really loved that. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of where I ended up. That's where I am now, and that's kind of where I feel like I'm going to stay. I think.
Yeah. I. I mean, your voice is so natural in this genre. You know, just reading, I didn't feel when I was reading the Redemption of Morgan Bright, I felt like you were right in the pocket. You know, to use a musician term, you can when you're playing in a band, you can tell when everything's just like in next gear, and it's just right. Um, and you can tell when you see that. When you're watching a live group and they're in the pocket like that, you're just like, okay, I'm witnessing some incredible shit right now. I felt like you were right in the pocket with the Redemption of Morgan Bright. I didn't feel as if you were writing from outside the genre or if you were experimenting or stepping into something unfamiliar. In fact, I felt like there was a tremendous amount of work that must have gone into how intricately you you laid out the story because I don't want to give a bunch of spoilers because the book is still relatively well, it is new. There's a lot that happens time sequence wise in that story that is sensitive to like literally by the page. So I was like, wow, this is effort. Like this takes a lot of effort to do it this way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Man, that's a huge compliment because when I'm reading a horror novel, the thing that I know first almost always is, do I feel like the author is in control of this, right?
Mm,
Because
yeah.
we can try to get our grip on a really fantastic idea, and sometimes we're chasing that idea and we're almost writing after it, right? We're in its wake
Mm,
and we're writing
right.
after this idea, and then it disappears on the horizon and we go, okay, what do I do now? And sometimes I'll read a book or a short story and I'll go, oh man, it feels kind of like they lost the thread and they lost control here. And so that's kind of my greatest fear, is having a story that's layered, multifaceted like this one, and losing the thread. And in this case, I was very happy with how I tied it up at the end. You don't get all the answers. Just because you tie something up doesn't mean you get all the answers. Like, I don't explain, I do not explain exactly what happened, the supernatural stuff. I don't give you the
Right.
explanation for all of that. I give you some history of it. And giving some history of it through sort of the multimedia stuff that's in the book, that's how I'm expressing control, which is this there's something about this land, and
Mm,
here's some hints about what is going on in this land. But I'm not gonna, at the very end of the book, go, by the way, reader, here's everything, here's why, here's blah blah, because then it's like,
yeah.
who gives a shit? Like, it's that takes away the mystery, it takes away the wonder at that point. So I'm glad it worked for you. I appreciate that. I hope it works for most readers,
Yeah.
though I know it won't work for everybody. It is a twisty thing. You do have to pay attention. You have to do a little work as a reader with this book.
Well, I wouldn't step away from, if you start reading this book, I wouldn't step away from it for very long. And I know there's some people that can read the same book for a month. And, with the way you've got this story constructed and the level of detail that's pertinent at every given point, at least through the first half of the story for real. Because at that point, you kind of like, all right, I've got my hands on people's heads. Like,
Yeah,
I know who's going where, what's happening, and all that stuff. I just don't know where it's going to go. That kind of layer. So if you're the kind of person that's like, I'm just going to read for a quick minute and come back, I would say wait, because this book is going to reward you in spades if you can really see everything, as it's kind of like all the dominoes are falling right into place. And I was reading it on my phone because I had a NetGalley copy.
oh yeah.
Um, and I was having a blast because it was like I had all the excuses in the world all of a sudden to be reading. I was like, oh, I gotta take the dog out. Usually I have to leave my in the house. I'm like, oh, I got my phone. I'm just gonna go out and read. And I'm like sitting out there, and then the dog's like staring at me like, dude, can we go in? Like, I'm done. And I'm like, no, no, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. I
Yeah,
love it when you try to steal seconds and minutes here to like continue reading this book, carry it around
yes,
with you. I absolutely love that. And I mean, look, I love big rewards for the reader if taking a big just quilt of things and weaving it all together for the reader at the end to be like, holy shit, this is what's happening.
yeah,
That's a huge reward, but the best rewards come when there's a lot of work to be done. I think,
yeah.
it's there's I look, I am firmly a fan of a book that's just like a pacey, engaging, propulsive story. I'll read that any day, right? Um, but sometimes I want something that's really gonna just make me go wow and really challenge me. And in that respect, like, I'm thinking about Katrina Ward or Jeff Vandermeer's, and of course my love for Vandermeer is not all hidden in this book. There's some passages, before I'm accused of, oh, you're just trying to rip off Vandermeer. There are some passages in here that are me channeling Jeff Vandermeer. There's no doubt about it. Like, I
Well, it's
I
hard to lose
absolutely
that.
I absolutely love, I mean, Annihilation's still my favorite. And I do a little bit of that in here. I mean, just I love the wonder that Vandermeer creates in so much of his writing. And Area X and Annihilation is a great example because does he ever explain to you what it is? No, but there's a story within that. You're given a scenario. There's a story within that. I mean, so many great books do that. I mean, it doesn't even have to be horror. Like in science fiction, Neil Stephenson did it with Seven Eves. The very first paragraph, the moon explodes. You never learn why the moon explodes. The story is about everything after that. The Expanse did the same thing with Protomolecule. Like this thing just appeared and it started fucking everybody up.
I've been reading. This is my first public confession of this, so you guys can all laugh at me or not, whatever. But like, I've been reading a lot of EMP post-apoc lately because I'm in an EMP post-apoc project right now, and so I'm trying to make sure that I've completely understood things. And it was really hard for me at first because I was looking for an answer to why all of these certain things I was going to have to build into this world were happening. And like, then I realized, like, I don't do this with horror. Why am I doing this to myself with science fiction? And I thought, well, it's because you're an engineer and you're expecting
Yeah.
answers for everything logical. Like wherever there's a logical loophole, you're trying to fill it. You're
Yeah.
naturally inclined to do that. I think that's one of the beauties of horror is that you can leave that person's mind alone for a little bit and let them come up with the weirdest, craziest thing it could possibly be that they've whipped up.
It'll always be more the mystery behind the veil of your own mind will always be more terrifying than putting something right on the page, because it will always be there. It will always be changing shape because they won't be told exactly what it is. Now that's I think leaving some mystery is fine. I think that if you just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and leave a bunch of unanswered questions that should be answered, I think that's different. I don't like that,
Absolutely.
I like leaving a little bit of wonder and a little bit of mystery in the story, because that's kind of how the real world works too. Like, this book has supernatural elements to it, but it's consistent. Like, you're not going to get all the answers with a supernatural event, So
Especially
yeah.
if you're talking to Charlotte.
Yeah. I mean, no. Well, Charlotte goes from meek two-dimensional creation to kind of running the show.
Yeah. Yeah, she kind of does.
Yeah. I had so much fun with her.
Oh my gosh! Like so for those that haven't read the book yet, when you start this book, you're gonna meet Charlotte, and oh my gosh! Like immediately, I was like, "What is this domestic psychosis business? What is this?" And I was like, "Oh, what a succinct yet poignant exploration of the restriction that society has placed on women, primarily older women, not older as in like, but mature women, adult women that are in relationships.
Right.
It's like this societal expectation about the relationship between a husband and a wife, and you could be deemed, institutionalized based on our perspective on whether you meet the mark as a domestic person, right? Like, it's crazy, and that stood out to me right away. It's like two big themes that jumped out at the beginning of the book were your exploration of women's rights, and the other one was just this straight up like care of mental health care for women.
Yeah.
Was that like something that was there from the beginning? Was that part of the concrete, the foundation?
Yeah. I mean, I can't talk about this book without talking about the environment we're in right now, where women's rights are under attack yet again. And one of the main points of this story thematically, this is a story, and I believe in writing self-contained stories that the story holds up. You don't have to know anything about what's going on in the external world, but the external world does shape the stories I write. And one of the things that I am trying to do is to give an example of how things can go backwards. It's a logical fallacy to assume that, hey, we've reached this point with human rights or women's rights, or civil rights. And so we've progressed this far, and progress never goes backward, because that's a huge fallacy.
Right.
And honestly, that fallacy is biased because we live short lifespans, relatively speaking. And
Sure.
so that's why history is so important to learn. That's
Yep.
why we have history classes, so we don't repeat it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I have seen, when I wrote this book, I had several people tell me that the scenario I'd set up, and the book, you're never given a date on when the book takes place,
That's true.
but you can surmise there's plenty there that this is contemporary / sometime in the near future. It's contemporary.
See, I
And
had it going backward
well, and the reason,
at first.
yeah, right. And
Yeah.
and that's on purpose. So
Right.
there's enough clues because there's certain technology being used.
Right.
The detective in the first scene, he tells Charlotte, hey, this thing on my lapel is a camera. I'm streaming this to all these
Right.
other offices. But then you see how these people are named. They all very intentionally have Victorian names.
That's exactly what it was, I think.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
you see the term, how they speak. Like Charlotte sort of speaks in that 1950s mid-Atlantic. You can almost hear her accent. She speaks in
Yep.
this kind of formal way, right? And it's got a very 1950s vibe to it. That's all intentional, because even though the time period is set as contemporary, I wanted to show us going backwards in terms of how, patient rights, women's rights are currently, I guess, their current course. And, that's why the book literally starts with a statute, because, of course, this asylum is placed on the high plains of Nebraska, right?
Which
And
caught me off guard, by the way.
yeah. It's fun. I'll tell you in a minute. I'll tell you why I chose that. But
Okay.
there's a statute from Nebraska, and it's a very realistic looking statute, and it mirrors, and that's because it mirrors actual statutes that existed back in the 1800s, establishing that a husband could have his wife committed for any reason without due process. Just, I think she's crazy, I want a new wife, or I want to institutionalize my wife because she's rich and take control of her money. That happened too. And I resurrected that as sort of the point from which we move forward, because states like Nebraska, Texas, where I live, there, and many others actually now, since I wrote the book, are trying to get rid of no-fault divorce, right? Which
Really?
is, yeah, oh yes, yeah.
Crazy.
There are bills on the books that they are trying to pass to get rid of no-fault divorce. Now, why would they want to do that? Because it's a way of keeping women in marriages that they don't want to be part of. A law was just passed in Missouri that a pregnant woman cannot have her divorce finalized while she's pregnant. Okay, it's absolutely insane. And so we're seeing this all around. Like right now, there are municipalities in Texas that, of course, abortion rights have been basically wiped out in Texas. There are now municipalities that will not let you. It's illegal to drive through them to get to New Mexico to go have abortion care. And that's all actually happening right now. So for anyone to say, oh, Chris, this is so hyperbolic, what you've done, I don't think it is. I think it's a mirror. I think it's a mirror to what we're seeing right now. But to the point about Nebraska, when I was constructing this, I was like, all right, when you write a scary story, you really have two choices. You get a forest, you either have a forest or you right? And I was like, Forrest has
Shout
done
out
way,
Cat Silva
Forrest
who
has
gets
done way
both.
more. Okay, yeah. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do. And I thought, has anyone? I am certainly not aware of any, certainly not asylum horror, but of any horror that takes place in a haunted house, asylum, whatever, in the prairie, in the far-reaching prairie to the horizon, right? And I was like, what if I put an old asylum out in the middle of nowhere in northwest Nebraska, just in the middle of an endless ocean of prairie? That would be kind of cool. And so that's how I started. That's how everything kind of flowed from there. That's the reason it's called Hollyhock House. Hollyhocks are perennials that they grow in Nebraska. And that's sort of where a lot of this kind of came from. There's a lot of prairie imagery in this book, in some of the, whatever you want to call them, hallucinations, visions that happen near the end of the book. There's a lot of beautiful prairie. And, it's just this idea of utter isolation too. So you can choose forest or snow. I put it on the prairie.
Which gets a lot of snow in the winter.
Yeah, it does. It does. There's a lot of snow happening in this book. So yeah.
Yes. It's funny you said you brought that up because it was one of the things that stood out to me that I was like, I'm gonna have to ask him why this location. Oftentimes it's familiarity. People write about their familiar environments, but that answered that question for me. And when I was reading it at first, I had to stop for a second and go, okay, I need to make sure I've got myself in the right place here because I'm so used to reading horror that's set in different environments. And it just so happened that I followed up reading the House at the End of Lacelyn Street by Catherine McCarthy, we were just talking about before we came on, right before I read this. And hers is set up in this like kind of remote Welsh kind of environment that's not potentially real. But it had a little bit of that same flavor to it. But there's nothing when you talk about plains, populated plains, there's nothing that compares to the American Midwest. I mean, that's crazy. And immediately, what popped in my head was Return to Oz. You remember that movie?
Oh man, that was yeah, that movie. I mean, let's just give a shout out to the 80s because everyone was on cocaine. Basically, any idea that they brought to the studio heads, they just snorted a line and they said, "Yeah, go do it." Right? I mean, because that movie is pure cocaine.
Yeah, and the beginning of that movie when she's like in the plane, which is supposed to be Kansas, in that movie, but like that's what I see because of that. That is like it left an imprint. And so when I'm reading your book, I'm thinking about like that environment. It's like it freaks me out probably because of how that movie made me feel back then. So that's really funny, man. Okay, I did have a question that popped up while you were answering. You mentioned readers having this experience where they're like in the middle of reading something, maybe their perception of what's happening because there is a bit of planned ambiguity in there, that they have kind of like a wow like moment in their reading because their own mind is exploring the levels of fear or depth of emotion or whatever the case is, that you've kind of dropped them right into this, and you've said, learn to swim. Like I'm putting you in the water, but it's up to you to figure out how much of your face you can keep above water. And that's basically, their perception of what's happening, their ability to do something with that mentally. Was there a part when you were writing where you had a wow moment, where you were writing a scene that maybe came to life in a way that you were kind of not expecting, and you were like having your own kind of moment like that in the story as the writer?
Yeah, well, so two things. First of all, it's a first person POV story for the most part.
Right.
And you get two first person POVs. One is Charlotte and one is Morgan, right?
Right.
The wow, and that's also one of the reasons why you might be disoriented and why you need to kind of just stick with it to get your bearings, because the person who is there is in the same situation the reader is. The person is being introduced to this place and doesn't understand it. right? You're seeing it through their eyes, which I think is perfect for an asylum story like
Right.
this, where there's a big mystery. And I did battle with how I would do the POVs and tense, which I don't know if you noticed, but when Charlotte's recounting what's happening, she's talking to the detective, and then you get her POV inside the asylum. It's all past tense.
Oh,
Later,
her
when
her her POV in the asylum was past tense.
in the asylum is
Right.
first person past tense.
Right.
Later, when Morgan kind of regains control from Charlotte, it becomes present tense because
Right.
she is reporting it as it's happening to her, to the reader.
Right.
So we switched tenses, but it was needed.
Mm.
And believe me, I don't jack around with POV and tense just to be pretentious. Like that was the right choice, right, for this. I'm not
Yeah.
going to dip into second person just to be like, look at this. But but to answer your
That'd be
question,
like a super nerd thing to do, man.
right? Oh yeah, to that yeah. I mean, second person, you got to be special. But
Yeah.
but there was a wow moment for me, and I'll tell you that the pitch on the story is a woman assumes a false identity, has herself committed to an institution to solve her sister's death. Okay, so when I set out to write it, I was writing before I ever wrote the transcript chapters with the detective. That came later. That was something I was like, you know what, I need to do this. That came later. It
Mm.
started as straight up prose chapters, and the chapters
Wow.
were this woman Morgan acting as Charlotte, going in and having a process of discovery. The whole time, she's Morgan. On the outside, she's Charlotte, but she's Morgan. And what happened was that as I had her, what happened to Morgan happened to me. Like, this is so weird. As I was writing Morgan, behaving as Charlotte, Charlotte started to get stronger.
Mm.
And this persona of Charlotte began to take on a life of her own. And I went, wait a second. There's something to this story that I need Charlotte to be her own individual. And so that's what happened. I went back and re-engineered those pages to make it so that the second Morgan shows up, or very quickly after she shows up, you're shown a scene later that explains why she sort of became Charlotte.
Right.
But pretty quick, when Charlotte gets there, Morgan's gone. And Charlotte is
Right.
there. And you find out later why. But Charlotte is her own person. And so this book is written at the intersection of something that is akin to multiple personalities, or what is now called
Right.
dissociative identity disorder, and a possession story. And at
Right.
the end of the day, this is a possession story. The only twist, the twist to it is that, and this is all in the back cover copy. I mean, you can surmise what it is. I'm not spoiling
Right.
anything. The twist to it is that the possessor, the demon, whatever you want to call it, was created by a person who is possessed.
Right.
And so it's fucked up. But that's what I discovered. I didn't set out to write it that way, but that is the way it demanded to be written.
Oh, see, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, because as I was reading it, and I know that I assume I'm correctly identifying that pivot point where Charlotte becomes something maybe different than you thought she was when you first start the story, because of some unique treatment opportunities that Morgan experiences. The I was wondering how you got to the point where you drew such distinct lines between the two in the book. It was like almost like two distinctly different characters entirely. But as soon as you realize that this is Morgan, and you realize why Charlotte is it gave me an appreciation for how well you crafted that in the first quarter of the book, because in the first quarter of the book you could very easily uh, almost assume that Charlotte was going to be the continuity, right? It's
Right.
like, oh wait, she's not. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
then she
Well,
is, you know.
yeah. So, yeah. Charlotte, I tried to write Charlotte as distinctly as I can. And then when you start to
Mm,
get more of Morgan's voice,
yeah,
like, like Charlotte, like I said, she's very formal. She speaks in this kind of 1950s manner. She's very rule abiding. She wants to get along. She's not someone who's going to rock the boat. And in the very beginning, the first couple of pages, there are two characters talking about that, which is Morgan and her fake husband, right? They're talking about the character Charlotte. When you get there, remember, this is how she is. She's not like you, because Morgan's very
right.
different. And when you see
Yes.
Morgan show up, Morgan is a modern woman. Like
Yeah.
Morgan is a fully fleshed out person with fully fleshed out, um, you know, a past that she's not super proud of, but you
Right.
know, she loves her sister. She's trying to do her best. She's got all sorts of wounds and trauma. She's a fully fleshed out individual, but she's a modern woman. She doesn't talk like Charlotte talks, right?
Right.
She
Right.
even meant, I mean, she's from Pennsylvania. Like, she mentions how she had to get rid of her Yinzer accent, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so she's a completely different individual, and so they are as diametrically opposed as you can have, and that made for a brilliant conflict where Charlotte wants something that Hollyhock is offering, right? She's kind of figured it out, and Morgan does not want that thing. Morgan isn't sure what it is. Charlotte clearly knows, but Morgan later figures it out. And when she figures it out, she's like, fuck no, I don't want any part of this. But by then,
Yeah.
Charlotte has gained more control, more primacy over Morgan's body than Morgan.
Mm,
Charlotte becomes
yeah.
the stronger entity. And that causes a lot of problems for Morgan, as you might expect.
Yeah. I mean, my heart broke a little bit when I kind of realized how much of what Charlotte is. Um, it broke my heart a little bit for Morgan, because I was like, this is literally a coping mechanism for Morgan, right? Like, it's her way of becoming something different so that she can hide from this terrible experience she's having. And the irony in that, in this, I'm sure you did this very intentionally, because you've obviously thought your characters through, was that juxtaposition between the want and the not want. Like, not only was Charlotte a place to go, a place to hide, a thing to become, to try and establish some protection, but she begins craving, or I shouldn't use the word craving. She's very much receptive to the very thing that Morgan is trying to get away from. And it's like, how does the
Yes.
place you hide become the magnet for what you are trying to avoid?
You've put so well. I mean, in creating Charlotte, there's a very pivotal scene. I'll call it the identity stripping scene, but there's a very pivotal, very
Right.
traumatic scene where sort of the handoff is made between Charlotte and Morgan. And temporally, it happens at the very beginning of her commitment, but you don't learn about it until later. And
Right.
Morgan even says, I let myself go. I I wore Charlotte as armor, and thought that would protect me. And instead, she just took control. And now Morgan has created this thing that wants something that is very bad for Morgan,
Right.
but she's handed over control, thinking it would protect her. And now that I say that like that, my heart breaks too. You know, I
Yeah.
it was so it's so sad because she keeps trying to do this thing because she has this immense guilt, which I won't spoil why she has it, but she has this immense guilt,
Right.
which is why she's doing all of this, why she's had herself committed to this place. And in doing so, loses herself and basically
Right.
hands the keys over to Charlotte, which is just not good.
You know, this mental health aspect of it, you know, I think that the calculus may have been, do I give my life for this cause, right? Like, do I sacrifice everything to achieve this means, that she's obviously compelled to try and do this thing that, you know, I'm not gonna, like, again, it's like, guys, you have to read this book, you'll understand. but but in doing so, would you view, you know, I'm putting myself in Morgan's shoes here, I guess, in some way. Would you view the mental risks as severely a threat as you would the potentially the loss of life, for example? I think there's some people that would say, I'd rather die than go crazy. You know, I'd rather die than take on you know, lose my mental capacity. You know, if that's going to happen, just end me. And in some ways, that's like a risk that I think a lot of people in her situation probably wouldn't have assumed was going to be a potential outcome. You know, it's like I either go in and succeed or I go in and I fail. And what does failure mean? Possibly death, you know, but what about this thing in the middle? You know, could it be
Yeah.
worse?
So
Yeah.
so that taps in on what I think is a really cool and rich sort of conflict here in this story, which is, of course, when Morgan takes on the persona, or actually the identity of Charlotte, and goes in,
Hmm.
she doesn't, at least outwardly, think it could end in death, right?
Right.
And and it's only when she gets in that she realizes things go a lot harder inside Hollyhock than she had suspected, and that might be a possibility. Um,
Right.
but I, you know, she had presumed it was a for 30 days and that was it and it was going to be over, and
Yeah.
she'd find something out, maybe she wouldn't, but at least she would have paid homage to her sister. Like she would have
Right.
done something to make her feel better about what happened to Hadley. But there is this moment where, and I love this because as Charlotte becomes more fleshed out and gains like literal flesh as a person, separate from Morgan but living in the same mind,
Hmm.
they have this conversation. There's this conversation later where they're looking in a mirror, right? And Morgan is talking to herself as Charlotte, which is one of my favorite scenes. And Charlotte, you know, Morgan is like, at this point, she's sort of despondent. She hasn't gotten the answers she thought she was going to get. She's kind of beating herself up because she's like, what did I think I was going to do? Like, did I think I was going to break into an office and like find some file that admitted what happened to Hadley? Like,
Right.
what did I think I was going to do? And Charlotte says this is just basic. This is your pathetic suicide. You always wanted to come here and get punishment. That's what you
Hmm.
wanted. And she sort of cuts to the bone. And even though Charlotte kind of becomes this malignant entity, what makes her so, okay, I'm going to use this word, fun as a character, is that she's often right. She's often speaking the truth about Morgan. In fact, you know, as we know at the very end, there's a big truth nugget that Charlotte drops on Morgan. And Charlotte is doing this throughout. And, you know, she calls Morgan out. She's like, hey, you know, stop, you know, crying in your palms here. This is what you wanted. You know, you
Yeah.
wanted it to go bad because you wanted to do penance for what you did to Hadley, your sister.
Right.
And I love that. I love that dynamic there. So I hope that answered your question, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love it, man. So, I mean, because it was very clear to me that, because I tend to delve into psychological horror myself quite a bit in my writing. And so I'm always trying to play with the mind of a character in a way that I find terror terrorizing basically my
Right.
character's mental state so that I can kind of explore the bounds of that. And I've never done it where there was this basically like this dichotomy, right? Like there's like this multi-layered state because you do have two separate perspectives, but from the same mind, and it's fascinating to me. I made a post on X or Twitter or whatever we want to call it about reading The Redemption of Morgan Bright while listening during my drives to Nat Cassidy's Mary, and they're both like there's such great dives into the psychological elements of horror, and particularly for women of roughly the
Right.
same age group, but completely different stories, completely different environments, all the things, completely different outcomes, everything. But it was just fascinating to me to see how well you were able to explore that, and it puts a different bend on addressing things like mental health in a psychological horror or a psychological thriller, where I think that sometimes we feel like we have to go in and address those very serious conditions in a particular way for the reader to be able to sympathize with it, or for it to resonate with them, or for it to be logical, or whatever the case may be. And you got to kind of throw some of that out the window, in particular with psychological, because it is an exploration of how twisted and different and weird and the mind can act and can become. And to put it to put it into like this one beautiful, wild psychological condition and have it come through multiple POVs, I thought was brilliant. I loved it.
Oh, well, thank you.
Loved that.
Thank you. I mean, there was a lot of things at work. I appreciate that. I basically one of the things I learned in my research was that, back in the 1950s, especially, women were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. Now, what is that? No one really knew. The truth is
Measure
that,
it.
right, yeah, exactly. The truth, yeah, can you measure it? The truth
Yeah.
is that it was in many ways. Look, mental illness is real. So certainly
Yeah.
there are people with schizophrenia with different
Yes.
psychoses. Absolutely. But one
Yep.
of the ways that schizophrenia as a label was used was just to be like, your wife's acting in a way you don't like sounds like schizophrenia. You know, your
Right.
wife is hypersexual, sounds like schizophrenia. It's a type of schizophrenia. Or she's not sexual enough, schizophrenia. and
Mm-hmm.
and that so what I did with domestic psychosis was I was like, I'm going to just repackage what we saw in the 50s. And we're going to call it domestic psychosis now. And it's sort of it's almost a running joke among the women in Hollyhock that, a lot of them probably don't really have anything, right? They were just
Right.
stuck there by their husbands, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some of them clearly do have some issues, some of them don't, and then some of them believe they do because they've been told they do. And that's
Right.
Charlotte, right?
Yep.
That's Charlotte. So you're kind of getting a view of all the different ways this could manifest, whether it was legitimately diagnosed or not. Domestic psychosis was doing the same job as schizophrenia was doing in the 1950s for a lot of women who, frankly, weren't sick.
Right.
So certainly some were. Again, that's an important caveat, but many were not, and were simply labeled with this as a means to control. And so, for my book, it was called Domestic Psychosis.
Love it. I mean, just fantastic motivation. The not fantastic as a condition, but fantastic. There's a good. It's a good thing to explore, I think, because it helps shine some light on the injustice that these poor people had to experience at the hands of just a bunch of maniacs. You
Mm-hmm.
got to be crazy to do that to a perfectly sane, perfectly healthy person just for other, selfish
Yeah.
reasons. But All right, dude, I got to ask you a question
Hmm.
before I forget and before I get too far down, losing track of something that I was wondering the whole time I was reading this. What were you listening to while you were writing this book? Do you listen to music while you write, or was this
So,
are you face down?
so as I'm actually, so in all my books, I have a list of metal bands I was listening to
There
in the
you go.
acknowledgments. Okay, so far, so I'm 3 for 3. Now, these these bands that I was listening to are bands I was listening to during the period of time I was writing. When I'm
Gotcha.
straight up writing, very rarely am I listening to anything with words or a really defined rhythm or beat,
Gotcha.
because then I'll plug into that and I'll start headbanging. Um, so I have a list of all these. Looking at them, there's a lot of sort of black metal, grindcore, um, some death metal and stuff. Um, there is one band, it's this German band. I can't tell what they're saying, but they're awesome. They're called Ara, Aara. And I was able
Yes,
to
they're
listen to
great.
them. What's that?
They're great.
Oh, you know them.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, they're so amazing because they're like it's almost like this kind of ambient black metal, but then it kind of plugs in and you get this incredible riff or this incredible tune melody. But I was kind of able to listen to them on my, headphones, um, without it being too distracting. But in the back of, if for anyone who buys the book, if you want to know what I was listening to during the period of time of this book, all those bands are listed. The main ones. I always forget a few, but the ones I was really like churning, um, and and I will say that every blue moon I pull something from a song, and I actually did in this book. I learned a new word,
Excellent.
which I didn't know. And actually,
Yeah.
that band that I learned it from is not in the book because they're not metal, but they it was on my Spotify playlist. Um, I think the band is called Back Channels, maybe. Anyway,
Okay.
it's this kind of, I don't know, like goth 80s kind of I don't know, shoegaze. I'm not exactly sure what it is,
Hmm.
but I'm listening to the words, and I can't make all the words out, but I'm listening to the words, and I hear this word, and you'll recognize this from the book. I hear this word nacreous,
Yes.
Nacreaus, nacreous, and I'm like, oh, I'm like, what's that? And I already had this motif in and oyster and pearlescent and all of this. And so I look up nacreous, and that's what it is. It's basically nacreous is like pearlescent mother. I'm like, oh my
Ah.
God. It fit so perfectly with the feel and the tone of the book that that refrain that the women have to listen to in the headphones is, build for
Yep.
them the nacreous home. It just fits so perfect. So I pulled that straight from, I learned a new word, used it in a book because it fit exactly right.
We're all learning, kids.
Yepper.
um, I loved it, man. I have to be careful with that because when I first started writing, I was like, I'm gonna sneak little
Oh yeah.
song titles into sentences and all these things. And at one point, my editor was like, "Hey, I see what you're doing.
Yeah.
Uh, this one you got to change. This is probably going to be a copyright, and this one, yeah, that one will work."
Yeah.
It's like going through. Um, I had all, just kind of embedding a bunch of that in my work, just so that if people listen to the same music, they would possibly pick up on it as a
Well,
point of the story.
well, just know that I have done the same thing. There are song titles in all three of my books.
Mm,
I don't remember what they are, but I know they're there. Um, Song titles are not copyrighted, so it's okay to
right.
say a song title in
Yeah.
a book. But you're right. Yeah, I mean, put it in there if it fits, but you don't want to get like smashing it over the head, like, look what I did.
Yeah, I had tucked a periphery reference in
Oh yeah.
and a Radiohead reference into the same page, and I think that was the thing that like
Ah,
he saw both and went, wait a second, what are you doing?
yep.
I
You
love this
peeked
song
your peeked your
Radiohead.
head up like a meerkat, and you got
Yeah,
caught.
yeah. Yeah, the Radiohead song I think was "Everything in Its Right Place." I just
Mm,
freaking love that song, and it's not a normal way to say that,
right.
so I think that's what makes it stand out. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
so you and I kind of experienced one very similar thing in our adult lives, kind of pre-writing. A
Mhm.
lot of the people I've interviewed, they've been writing for decades, and this has just kind of been a gradual maturation of what they've done. You and I are similar in the fact that we stepped into these professions for several decades and kind of hit pause on writing in some form of another, and then came back to fiction later. How were you writing a lot before you stepped into your profession, and were you writing horror or even sci-fi or fantasy or anything when you were younger? Like, when did this start for you?
Um, other than visual art and doing some basic comics and stuff like that, I never wrote. That's what
Really?
that was the hardest part as I was when I decided I was going to be a writer in 2015. I went to the movie Interstellar. I came home. I ordered the book The Science of Interstellar by Kip Thorne, who's an astrophysicist at Jet Propulsion Laboratories. I read that book in like 3 days. It's amazing. It's all about the black hole gargantua that they created for the movie. They wrote like they published like three peer-reviewed papers off of
Wow.
creating this black hole, which eventually they were validated in how it would look when we actually got the photos of Sagittarius A at the center of our galaxy. Enough astrophysics, but the point is that I was so just inspired by how amazing that movie was. I was like, I want to write space stories. This is Chris in 2015. Hey, someone should write space stories. I wonder if anybody writes space stories, right? Total,
It's
total dipshit,
so
right?
good, dude.
Total neophyte. Up
I
until
love it.
then, I was still fully practicing as a lawyer. I always read tons of nonfiction, whether that was like I really liked reading about um, anything having to do with outer space, astrophysics, that stuff, which came in handy a few years later because I wrote my book Stringers, where I sort of emptied the bank on outer space stuff. Um, but I had never even thought, never once thought I should be a writer or write a book. It was so strange. And again, it was a little intimidating when I decided I wanted to try because I tried to educate myself. I listened to podcasts, I read interviews. And what do you hear? Every single interview, every single writer is, oh, I knew I wanted to be a writer from 7 years old. I was writing from, I came out of the womb with a pencil in my hand and I was writing. And
Right.
that of course is the natural progression, right? Usually you gravitate towards something you were interested in your whole life. I was always a creative person. I was always doing art. So that was there, but it was almost cold turkey, like coming to something cold turkey from
Wow.
not ever even thinking about it to diving in. And it was like one of those things. It's like, how could anybody know that they would love being I don't know, a dog sled racer? How could you ever know you would like that until you are exposed to it, right?
Mm.
Or how could you ever know that you would want to be an ice skater until you're exposed to it? I was never exposed to writing creatively.
Mm.
And I started doing it. I just sat down in January of 2015. I came up with a space story and I started writing. And I was addicted. The second I started doing it, it was just one of those things. I'd never tried it before. And I was addicted.
Wow.
And I can tell you, I have written every day for, that's 9 years ago, that 9 years. And most of that time, thousands of words a day.
Wow.
Because I knew when I started writing, I was 38. And I knew I was like, look, I don't have time to screw around here. if I'm going to do something and get to a point that my writing is passable, I have to work really, really hard. And so, start from day one, I was listening to podcasts, I was reading blogs. Shout out to Janet Reed, who just passed. She ran Tracker or Query Shark, and
Right.
she had a blog, janetreed.blogspot.com. I would read several of her entries every day with my morning coffee and just learn about the industry of writing, the publishing industry, what to expect, all of that. And I immersed myself. So I was writing every day, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with creating from nothing. I utterly love it. And I would look back over what I had written in the previous months, and I would see how much progress I'm making. Because I could look from just something I'd written 3 months before and go, that is a pile of doo-doo. And the fact that I knew it was a pile of doo-doo meant that I was progressing because I could appropriately evaluate it, right? And
Right.
once I realized that I was developing a craft, developing a skill, it was a complete addiction. And now I'm just a complete student of it, and I haven't stopped writing since. In fact, my manuscripts are piling up. We can't submit them fast enough. Um, I've got one book that's about to go on. I mean, I've had a book go on Sub and Die that is shelved. We hope we might be able to use it as a second book if I ever get a 2-book deal. We'll see. That both me and my agent loved this book, but it was different. It was very different. I understand why people passed on it. I've got a prequel and a sequel half written for The Phlebotomist, if that ever comes to be. I've got a sprawling middle grade written. That was the first thing I ever wrote, which there's life there. There's gold in them there hills, but that was my first thing. So I have to rework that. I've got about to go out on Sub. It's a unique haunted house thing. And then I've got one that I'm halfway, I wrote, I don't know, 150 pages in like 2 weeks because I was so jacked about this story, which I think you could call it like Bird Box plus The Last of Us, but it's not zombies. And
Okay.
yeah, so,
Nice.
so now I'm just writing so much. And I always,
Love
sometimes
it.
I'm neurotic. So I sometimes have to remind myself, hey, you do this because you actually enjoy it. And it's true, like creating this thing and creating real relationships between people that only exist on the page is like magic. So I love that. Anyway, that was a long answer.
No, that was perfect, man. I mean, I love all of that because I think there's a lot of people who, I mean, to your point, like, the traditional answers are, I knew at some point as a teenager or as a young adult or as a kid even that I wanted to write and tell stories. I came from a very logical, blue collar, roll up your sleeves and pound your body to dust working kind of family, and it was like, yeah, that's all awesome and you're really good at it. However, what else are you going to do to make money? And it was
Yeah.
like, you can do that, but you can do that after you work. And it was, they never tried to kill the dream, but they were very much about like, you need to establish yourself as a tradesman or as a professional of some sort so that you can nurture your art while, in the little bit of time you're not working. And this way, if you do ever get into art, well, you've got something to fall back on when it
Yeah.
fails.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
look, there's
like,
something to be said for that, right?
yeah,
I mean, I had a career before this, and that has given me some freedom to pursue
hmm,
this now.
yep,
The
yeah,
the other thing too is I kind of know myself. I know my younger self. I freely admit I did probably the most maturing as an adult that I ever did between probably ages 30 and 40. That 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 decade was where I really learned who I was, and I'm still learning every day. I think we all are.
yeah,
But that decade I really solidified who I was and how I wanted to be. And perhaps if I had discovered the writing bug before that, I may not have had the maturity to stick with it, to really learn the craft. I may not have. So everybody's journey is different. And while I wish I had been writing earlier, maybe that wasn't in the cards for me because perhaps I wasn't ready for it. But when it did start, I was ready, and I dove in
Yeah.
pretty enthusiastically.
Well, you've used the time you've had available for it very wisely. Your work is beautiful.
Thank you.
You have a great grasp of story. You have a wonderful voice. I've really enjoyed the redemption of Morgan Bright, and this was my first read of yours. So for me, it was like maybe I came in at the right time.
It,
It's like I'm getting peak Chris right now. This is awesome.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah.
Well, maybe not peak in the future, but peak for today, right? Like
Peak for
we'll
today.
continue to,
Yeah.
yeah, continue to grow. And I just I feel blessed that I was able to read this story on NetGalley before it was released. So thank you, and big shout out to all the access that was provided by your publisher. To be able to put that in my hands. And did you want to mention your publisher and agent?
Yeah.
Your
Yeah, sure. I mean, my agent is Sarah Megabo at KT Literary.
Okay.
She's awesome. She sold this book to Angry Robot, who published it on spec. So we offered 3 chapters of this and a synopsis, and they were able to decide to buy it off of that. Now, I mean, I had a track record with them. My first 2 books are out from Angry Robot Books as well. And so, but I also want to give a special shout out to my editor, because my editor, Gemma Crefield, at Angry Robot, has been with me for all 3 books. So she has seen me pivot, like, and jump from one thing to the next. And we have a great working relationship. She's exactly what you want in an editor as far as your structural edits, because she, without any, we have one of those relationships that's just, we just know the other person is trying to do what's best for the book. So neither of us get like emotional about it. Like, and if one of us is going to, it'd probably be me, because I'll create like a big set piece or something. I'll be like, no, I really want this. And what's interesting is Morgan Bright did have a scene in it. That was a crazy scene. And she was like, what did she say? She said something like in her editorial letter. She was like, bro, she's like, bro, I don't think you need this. I think those were her exact words. And I was like, yep, you're right. I just needed to hear it. So we have this like great relationship as far as the editing process goes. So
That's
who
so
I'll
good.
shout out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing their names with us, and big shout out to Angry Robot and to your amazing editor, because I know how that feels, man, to have that kind of
Yeah.
relationship with your editor is gold. And I always tell people, they're like, oh, well, what's your one thing you would tell a writer? And I'm like, don't write alone.
Yeah.
I don't care necessarily how you go about solving that problem, but for me, it's having the right editor is the single most impactful thing I've done. So,
Oh yeah.
big shout out to your team, man, and what a wonderful job you guys did on the redemption of Morgan Bright. Chris, thank you so much for sharing your amazing insight into the story, your craft, your path, man, where you're going. I mean, you just you've been so gracious with your time and with your emotions and with all of your insight into the book. And I'm grateful that you were able to break away this week. Happy launch week, and come spend some time with us.
Thanks, Lucas. Well, I really enjoyed meeting you at AuthorCon, and I actually met you at Halloween Hangover, I think, in Richmond,
That's right.
and then AuthorCon. And so it's been really cool. I mean, this is one of those things where, I find it very rare that I can't just jump right in and start talking to someone in this community. Just like we could talk forever. And And so this has been really cool. I'm honored with the invite completely. This was an awesome conversation. So thank you and good luck with the podcast.
I appreciate it, man. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we avoided roasting LP Hernandez the entire time. So
Oh, well. How much more time do we have left? I believe that LP actually, and I'm going to say this out loud because he did say it in a tweet to me. He does prefer Dr. Esquire as his name
that's all
instead of LP Hernandez. So if everyone listening could refer to Les Hernandez as Dr. Esquire, that'd be fantastic because he requested
right. He
it.
did.
He
He did.
did.
In fact, I asked him to sign a book for me, and he signed it, Esquire Hernandez. So it
There you
sounds pretty
go.
official to me. I mean, he's
Get
signing
what you
books that way.
ask
So
for. Yep.
that's right. All right, now we can use this segment of the show to see if he actually listens and
That's
watches
right.
this when we ask him, hey, did you see the episode we did? It was
Yeah.
wonderful.
Hey man,
All right.
we've been doing your work, Les. We've been telling everybody about how you'd like to be referred to now.
Yeah. And if you guys aren't familiar with Les, I encourage you to go check out his books. And if you do some digging into his stories, you'll understand where the Esquire thing comes from. Rightly deserved. He
Yep,
deserves the title.
absolutely. Yeah, no, he's an awesome writer.
Excellent. All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your help. Thanks for joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you on a future episode, brother.
Oh, for sure. Take care. Thank you.